Let me begin by, first of all, thanking Siatini Tax Justice Network Africa, the Stop the Bleeding campaign, for putting this together at a very important time, and especially coming hot off the heels of so many exciting things. And hopefully, Paul, some of the things that I'm about to say may take you out of your funk. So I think the broad question about why do we need to reform the global economic architecture, I'll bring us back to the continent just to illustrate why we need to do some of these things. We have four countries that have defaulted on their debt: Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Chad, and there's a few others that are not too far the edge of default, including my very own country in Kenya, where I'm joining you from. Number two, we have seen a whole bunch of public protests that have taken foothold across the continent. Again, in Kenya, in Uganda, where we're having the center point for this press conference, in Nigeria, in Ghana, and more broadly speaking, across developing countries in Argentina, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on. And when one looks at this perspective, the question that we need to ask ourselves is what is facilitating or motivating people to get onto the streets and demand changes, demand more accountability and transparency from their leaders? It's because the ecosystem that our countries are functioning in are not serving the interests of citizens, but rather, as Jane and Chennai have mentioned, are serving the interests of a very few countries and even a fewer number of multinational corporations that seem to be able to siphon billions of dollars out of the continent and the global south more generally every year, and without being held to account, but at the same time continuing to exacerbate indebtedness, inequality, poverty, a lack to public services, and so on. And why is this important in the context of debt? Well, 3 points here. I think number one, the point that Jane has mentioned around, you may hear her mention things around trade deficits, balance of payments deficits. You've heard Chennai mention issues around illicit financial flows, taxation rules, and so on. What all of these combine to do at the national level on the continent is to create a broader, what we call fiscal gap or budget gap. And this creates a fertile ground for governments having to borrow in order to plug those gaps. So our inability to trade high value goods or to move up, higher up the value and supply chain in terms of manufacturing and industry leads to a gap that we need to plug through attracting foreign direct investment. Our inability to raise domestic revenues through taxation forces us to have to give tax incentives for foreign direct investment to come in. And that creates a fertile ground for us to have to borrow. Now, borrowing, you'll hear a lot of people talk about borrowing not being bad. It just depends how it's managed, how it's used, and so on and so forth. But in the current context, the borrowing that many African countries are doing is actually very bad because a lot of it is being used to run government operations rather than investment and development. A lot of the borrowing that's being done is being used to service existing debts. And this is creating a very vicious cycle of dependency of borrowing to run government and pay debt, as opposed to invest in development and invest in citizens. And so it locks us in this very difficult position. A lot of that is perpetuated by the issues that both Chennai and Jane have raised, but also underpinned by the governance structure around how international debt is managed and governed. So primarily, this is now done by the International Monetary Fund, whose job is to ensure macroeconomic stability, but at the same time, it also acts as an insurance policy guarantor for creditors. And so what it does is it provides a line of credit to developing countries on the continent so that developing countries can continue going to international capital markets to access commercial debt in order to fund their government operations. And so we're in this vicious cycle because when it comes to then having to restructure or reschedule our debt, we are caught in this very difficult place. So this is another problem around the debt governance structure. The third point is that we need not to look at debt as an individual item. And I think these are some of the lessons that we've learned from the 2000s when we had the HIPIC debt cancellation period. Again, another point in time where people often refer to say, we had debt cancellation, yet we are back in the same situation. Why do we know what needs to change? And I think the biggest thing here is that we cannot isolate debt in terms of the broader set of development finance instruments. They all have to work in tandem. Debt needs to be targeted. You need to have the right type of instrument, and you need to finance the right types of projects. At the moment, you have a mismatch or a misalignment between the type of debt instruments that our governments are using to finance long-term projects. Some of these instruments are very short-term, and therefore, even before the projects are completed in terms of their construction, the debts are already coming due. And that's why you're having this situation. So over and above all of that, what are the kind of things that we need to think about? And if we're going to try and get a better reformed global economic system, an economic architecture that is fairer, is more just, and addresses the debt issue from the perspective of a borrower and not necessarily from the lender. Well, one of them has been mentioned, and this is about how do we ensure borrowing countries and particularly African governments have a same singular powerful voice at the negotiating table. Because debt, just like tax, just like trade, is a set of negotiations. You want to borrow, you negotiate the type and terms and conditions of the contract. If you are struggling to pay, you negotiate the restructuring, rescheduling, and so on. So we need a level playing field. We need a transparent playing field where are able to sit down together with their lenders and hash out a deal. At present, this is not happening. We have a system that predominantly favors creditor coordination. This is the common framework that I'm referring to, but it does not allow borrowers to come together, negotiate as a whole, as a team in a coherent and coordinated way. So what we are asking and what we are proposing is that we should have a similar process to that Chennai has described with the tax work and the tax rules, to have a similar process under the auspices of the United Nations, where developing countries and developed countries and creditors can all sit on the table as equals and negotiate in a fairer, transparent way and give, the benefit of the doubt to the borrowing country in order for it to not only meet its development objectives, but at the same time also meet its debt servicing obligations. But more importantly, there has to be a give and take. And at the continental level, African ministers of finance have for a very long time called for a review of the existing debt relief and debt restructuring processes that are in play. They've actually asked that some of these are not working, and we're seeing real life examples of this in the case of Zambia. We're certainly likely to see similar durations in terms of length, complexities, in terms of difficult creditors when the time comes for Ghana to enter its full restructuring negotiations. And we're certainly going to see this when Ethiopia starts negotiating its common framework restructuring program as well. And I think what is very fundamental here and why we're asking for a proposal and a process under the auspices of the United Nations is that it still remains the space where developing countries, especially from Africa, can wield a significant amount of cross power and influence without due stress that is currently put on them when they are negotiating in other spaces, particularly through the common framework, particularly through the G20, through the IMF, and so on and so forth. And more importantly, and I want to echo this very much of both what Chennai and Jane have said, this is an issue of sovereignty. Right now, the saddles of debt are impinging on the sovereignty of our countries. It's impinging on the sovereignty of our citizens. And so, whilst I do not want to dampen further your mood, Paul, it is important that we look at this architecture in a way that is progressive and enhances the voice of African countries and African citizens on the negotiating table. At the national level, of course, and on debt issues, we should not run away from the complexities that are at the national level as well. There are issues of transparency, accountability, and governance on how debt is utilized. And I think as we try and set up a global system that is fairer and just at the country level, it's important that at the national level we have equally robust systems that do not jeopardize the sovereignty and the rights of citizens when countries are deciding to take on debt. And certainly, as I mentioned when I began, the protests that we're seeing across the continent, in part, they are because of the level of indebtedness. It's because of the amount of borrowing that governments are doing. At the national level, borrowing is a deferred tax because at some point in the future, the government is going to use taxation to raise revenues in order to pay that debt. And so, members of the fourth estate need to be very much alive to these dimensions. It's important for us to fully understand also how the mechanics of debt works at the national level, the roles of different ministries, departments, and agencies within the governance system that hold government account when borrowing is being done. And so here the role of parliament becomes very important. The role of the judiciary becomes very important. The role of the media becomes extremely important in ensuring that the executive and the government bureaucracy is held into account when governments are borrowing. And finally, as I wrap up, I think it's that interconnectedness between national, continental, and global remains extremely important if there is going to be a coherent position. And what are the opportunities in the next 1 year, 1.5 years that lie ahead of us? So, the process that Chennai is currently involved in stemmed and started way back. Well, it's founded in a report from 2002, but the actual process started in 2015. This is through the United Nations Financing for Development process, which gives us the roadmap of how development finance is defined, how it's governed, and how it's generated and distributed towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So the fourth conference is taking place next year in Spain, and the process towards developing that roadmap started in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago. And with regards to debt, the group of African countries that Chennai has mentioned who are also doing tax on debt have asked for a global legal debt framework under the auspices of the United Nations. So that is a huge opportunity for us at the international level to support the African member states to develop the components of what that framework might look like, to develop the components of what a process of negotiations might look like under the United Nations, and to ensure that that is secured in the outcome document in Spain next year. So that's one huge opportunity at the global level. At the continental level, the African Union has within it, through the Abuja Treaty, the provisions and the instruments to set up and establish African Union financial institutions, such as the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, the African Monetary Institute, the African Investment Bank, and so on. These are important levers of negotiation. When Jane and Chennai talk about trade and finance and the cost of accessing this finance from the international market, having our own institutions to be able to negotiate on behalf of the continent is going to be a huge game changer. So at the continental level, supporting the processes to establish these institutions is extremely important. So the fourth estate has an important role here in asking their governments, there's this thing called the Abuja Treaty. Have you ratified it? Have you deposited the instruments back to the African Union Commission? Can we understand what progress is being made? And these negotiations and these discussions are currently ongoing. So it is extremely important at the continental level that we come together and support this African Union process in getting us through the door, in setting up our own levers and of negotiation and strategy and coherent positions. At the national level, there's an important role to connect what is happening at the continental and global levels with our national level. So, are we adjusting, for example, our domestic legislation to adapt to the changing landscape of our creditors? Many of our African governments are doing domestic borrowing, are borrowing from new bilateral lenders like China, like India, like countries from the Middle East, Russia, and so on. They have a different way of doing business. It's not a wrong way, it's not a right way, it's just different. But our laws adaptable enough to doing business with them. We have a lot more commercial creditors through different Exim banks, for example. We have Eurobonds and all types of different color bonds to deal with education, climate, gender, and so on. But our domestic policies in place to help safeguard us from situations where we're not able to pay back those bonds or we need to restructure them? Do we have dispute resolution mechanisms in them? We are currently experiencing the existential threat of climate emergency and energy transition. Do we have negotiation tactics in case we have climatic emergencies that can help us suspend our debt service while we recover from these climatic emergencies or COVID-19 type pandemics? So there are lots of these things that at the global level will also fit at the continental and national level. And as we think about reforming the global architecture, these are the things that we need to consider. These are the opportunities. I think, I like to look at the protests that are taking place as I conclude, that are taking place across the global south in particular, as an opportunity. It's not to put Paul in a deeper funk, but to say that people are finally realizing that the system is not working for them. It's working for a few elites, and that can no longer be the order of a state of play that we operate in, because people's lives are at risk, people's lives and livelihoods are endangered of being affected by the kinds of decisions and the kind of system that we work in. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much once again for the opportunity.